Animals want more than we eat. Where are we from? Life is rooted in Death's Republic. Where are we going? Our seed returns to Death's Republic. These cheery sentiments should inspire.
Hello and welcome to Grey Matters. I'm delighted that you can join me here today at the Alasdair Grey Archive. My name is Sorcha Dallas, and this series of podcasts is going to be looking at and exploring the life and work of Alasdair Gray, one of Scotland's most seminal artists and writers. We're going to be, first of all, focusing on his seminal 1981 novel Lanark and exploring key themes and motifs that appear within that book. We're going to be hearing from people who respected, admired him, loved and cared for him too. So for the first series of podcasts, we're going to be looking at the idea of Lanark and memory, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by Professor Alan Riach, Professor of Scottish Literature at Glasgow University, a writer and poet, friend of Alasdair's and attendee at the original, 1981 launch. So Alan, if I can just hand over to you and try and ask you to conjure up maybe what 1981 in Glasgow was like, what you were doing, how the city felt, what was going on culturally at that time.
Well, I suppose it was. I suppose it was a bit like Unthank. There was always that sense of it being. I'm pretty sure this was before the buildings were sandblasted, and the sense of it being lifted into a kind of, well, the Glasgow as cultural city of Europe came later. And there was that sense that the city at that time had come through from the aftermath of the Second World War through the 50s, through the 60s. And the 70s were certainly a different feel, a different decade altogether. But in 1981, it was still, that legacy was pertinent. And I was born in Airdrie, in Lanarkshire, darkest post-industrial Lanarkshire, so that atmosphere was not unfamiliar to me. But I had been to school in Kent, and I'd been to Cambridge University to do my first degree. And by 1981, I was back in Glasgow, working for a PhD at the University of Glasgow in the Department of Scottish Literature. And I was about 21, 22, 23 probably or 22 probably in January. February, March, April, round about, about 20:30, about 22, 23, thereabouts, something ridiculously, very young for my age, very bewildered. So that sense of the bewilderment of Thaw and the bewilderment of Lanark himself, trying to discover where he is and what he's doing, chimed. Before I read it, I had that sense that this was going to be a book of some interest, just in terms of its portrayal of a central character. I think that was partly understood, that there would be an autobiographical element in the novel, that Alasdair had been working on it for a long time.
So was that was accepted within people? Obviously were aware, as you'd said, Lanark was published obviously in 1981, but it was almost like a 30-year backstory to it being written and created. So was Alasdair, was he known at that time? Were people aware that he was working on this kind of masterwork, and what was the kind of general feeling or kind of understanding of that process?
Yes, they were. I did not have extensive or authoritative presence in the literary company of that era. But as a student doing the PhD, I was introduced in various venues and various occasions, and the Third Eye Centre, of course, where the launch took place, where the event took place, that I remember. That really was a lively and vivid and terrifically curious place.
And that was largely, do you think, due to, was it Tom McGrath and under his kind of?
Yeah, I think it was. I met Tom there, and that sense of. I had done a bit of work on the American poet Charles Olson, who Tom McGrath had been particularly interested in, the Beats and the Black Mountain poets particularly. So I had a conversation with him about that, I remember, and just talking to him about the Third Eye Centre as a venue, as a locality, and that sense of the international, seeing Scotland within a completely international community of our writers and artists of all kinds, nothing hampering in terms of its of the tradition that it carried and regenerated. But that location was a crucial one. So there were many events, and I remember the same era or the same period, the same months as Lanark's launch was also the launch of the exhibition called Seven Poets, with a very famous painting, big multiple portrait painting by Alexander Moffat of Hugh McDermott, George Mackay-Brown, Charlie MacLean, Ian Crichton-Smith, all of those men of that era, which is now the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, with photographs by Jessie Ann Matthew, poems, poets. The presence of that cultural, literary world was very, very present alongside its modernity and its international context. You know, there was a nice story about, I think it was if you went out of the bar, if you were looking for a translation for a Polish poem and shouted into the company, is there anybody here can translate from Polish? Somebody would say, "Ah, yes, I can." And when Tom McGrath told me this, he said, I thought when that happened, I thought I was doing the right thing. So that kind of international context was the place of the launch. So there was a general sense that I got from talking to people that Alasdair had certainly been working on this for a long time. Had certainly incurred the skepticism of some that it would ever be finished, and what it would be like if it was finished. And the few people that I met who had actually read some of it were impressed and anticipating something, but I don't think there was any real confident knowledge about in the general sense of the thing. That you were waiting for you know, there's a sense that a major thing could happen, but there wasn't a sense that it was secure. So that was part of the background.
And how did you then hear about the launch? I mean, you sent me recently.
I was simply aware of it, that there were various things going on all over all through that time. I remember my little pocket diary entry for that day just has the words Glasgow University Library, and then in the evening, 7:30 or whenever it was, Alasdair Gray reading Third Eye Centre. So you know, there was a sense that I'd keep my eye on the program. That's the original fold out panel for the Alasdair Gray launch.
And it's got his artwork right on the, and
the artwork's there, and the Seven Poets exhibition is there. And so, I mean, for some reason, I kept this and put it, you know, used it as a bookmark probably, but just as a souvenir of the event. So I was simply aware of these events happening at the Third Eye Centre and at the university, various other locations, and I was getting in touch with people throughout. You know, I was beginning to form friendships with some of the poets. I had met Hugh McDermott in 1977, 78, just before his death. I knew Edwin Morgan was a great mentor and friend, ultimately, that sense of him helping with the PhD I was working on and studying, reading widely. So there was a general awareness that Alasdair's work was coming to fruition, that it was something was going to happen. And there was a sense of encouragement, but there was also a sense of unknowingness and curiosity about it. So yeah, that was part of that world.
Of the scale of the novel, and the sense of, you know, not only in terms of what I was looking at and the themes and motifs, but also the ambition in terms of the illustration, the typesetting, you know, the fully formed object that it actually was. Was there a sense of that before, or?
Yes, I think there was. Again, my sense of it is that it was fragmented. It was fragmentary. There were people who had a sense of that, but there were also people who had a sense of different things happening, that he was capable of such things. You know, we knew about the murals and the artwork, and his work as an artist was very much part of his story. But there was no publication that you could say, read that and you'll find out about where he's coming from, what he's doing. There was no simple way in that respect. So it was a very Well, it was great. You just didn't know what was going to happen.
And then to turn up at the launch itself, and do you have memories of that?
Yeah,
Kind of
yeah.
walking in, who was there? I mean, I presume there's pictures of Alasdair signing. I know he was obviously, he was well known for doing that, for holding up a queue at a book signing, wasn't he? And not only being a personal dedication, but often a drawing too. So, can you talk a little bit more?
Yes, indeed, he did. That did happen. There were many people there who I knew vaguely, and had met sometime before. I wasn't there with any particular friend, I don't recall, but I think it was just being curious about what was going on. I do have to mention Kevin McCara, who was there, who a very good writer, sports writer, actually wrote for The Guardian. But before that, he was with Hamish White in the beginning, early days of the Mariscat Press. And he had worked at Glasgow University in the Scottish Literature Department, where he was a colleague, or I was a student there at the same time. So he was a friend, an acquaintance really at that time. And I remember him being there and, more or less buttonholing me and saying, you've got to pay attention to this because this is going to be really important. And he was much more in the depth of the thing than I was. And when the event happened, Alasdair was there, read, and the crowds were the crowd was very enthusiastic and very attentive and very curious. I mean, it wasn't at all, sycophancy or a group of friends who were there merely to support him. It was a group of friends certainly there to support him, but there was also a sense of literary people who were curious about what was going to happen here. So it was exciting in that regard.
And
I remember, I should just mention though that when I was impressed, and I thought, I picked it up and I got hold of a copy, and I remember just picking it up and looking at it and being, the first impression that you have when you flick through it and you read the sequence of, it's in the wrong order, and you think, is that a misprint? No, no. I mean, honestly, you do begin with that sense of what's gone wrong here.
Yeah.
And then you think, oh, wait a minute, this is something very deliberate, very, very and I don't know if you can make this out, but on the red panel, there's the signature from the date.
That's a book you bought at the launch, got it signed.
At the launch, and it was Kevin McCara, and I was holding it. He's saying, "You've got to buy it. Get him to sign it now."
Yeah.
And he was right, and no mistake. It was a terrific thing to do. The other nice wee thing that, again, this is the sort of thing I guess that will be famous to lots of people who were there and around at the time. But I remember a bookshop which was, if I remember correctly, just opposite where Scottish Opera is now, opposite the Theatre Royal. And there was a wee pile of these bookmarks, which were on the desk by the till, and you're just welcome to pick one up and take it away with you. So I've always kept that as well, which is famously the doctor's prescription. I think I have caught Lanark. What can I do about it? And the doctor gives the questioner a reply, but ends with the famous line: "The important thing is to drink heavily and not to worry if you do see a doctor." So it's not a doctor speaking at all. But the whole context of it was playful, but there was some depth to it, and the unknowingness of it was also a spur to curiosity. So it was a great event. There was lots of, I think, if I remember correctly, if I've judged this correctly, it went from that sense of, as the great painter Jack Yates once said, that a painting is an event. You can plan for an event, but if it goes according to your plan, it's not an event. And it was like that. It was like the thing had been choreographed to the extent that we would have the crowd, they would have the drinks, they would have the reading, and then we would see what happens.
So you bought the book, you got it signed, you took it home. Did you read it right after, or how long?
Yeah, I was looking, I've got a list of things that I read that year. And curiously, I mean, this is completely nerd territory, but I 1981 begins with, I remember reading the print studio publication called The Comedy of the White Dog. Again, it was at that time there wasn't. If you went to a bookshop at that time, there wouldn't be a Scottish literature section, and sometimes you would go into odd bookshops or odd shops, you know, like Fraser's in Buchanan Street, would have a wee bookshelf somewhere, and you might find strange publications that people might have just wandered by with a plastic bag full of magazines or books that they were trying to sell, and they would be there. So if you're hunting for books, as I was at the time, I would go to the second-hand bookshops. I would go to the shops that just look for curiosities that seemed relevant to what I was doing. So I remember picking up this wee a large format book of Alasdair's called The Comedy of the White Dog. So I'd read that, and then the same. Yeah, it must have been just shortly after I bought it. I'd read it. It's down here alongside Ian Crichton Smith, H. Rider Haggard, Raymond Chandler, Wally Soyinka, and a kind of non-sci-fi novel by Philip K. Dick.
Yeah.
So that was the sort of stuff I was reading at the time, and Lanark was part of that.
Do you keep a note every year of what you've read or what because you're referring?
Yeah, I mean, I've kept it. Yeah, since I was a wee boy, it's just one of those nerdy habits. I've kept a list of books I've read.
So you read it, and then others around you reading at the same time. Was there then a kind of ripple of discussion?
Yeah, there was. Whenever I do remember talking to people at parties or at events or whatever. Have you read? Have you read Lanark? What do you think? You know, what do you think? And I remember talking to someone saying, his first response was to say, "Well, it's very good, but it's in the wrong order." You know, and then it was just a kind of very Glasgow criticism of how it might have been improved. That kind of attitude. There was a sense of something has happened that will take some time to sink in. I think that's true. I think there was a sense of coming to terms with it. Eddie Morgan, I remember saying something of that kind, that he thought it was already significant as soon as he'd got hold of it. I was seeing Eddie quite regularly to help to more or less help me with a PhD. He wasn't my official supervisor, but we talked on all literary matters, and this was part of that conversation. So there was a sense that something serious had happened, and it would take time to sink in. And I remember another conversation, and I remember bringing it up with Alasdair himself later on, talking about it. I think maybe the first time we'd met. We met before that, I think, at an event at a translator's house, flat, a party, where we hadn't at that point we'd never met before, and he and I happened to be standing next to the drinks table, and we just looked at each other, and you have that moment where you think, I'm gonna say hello to somebody here, just see what happens, and open the conversation. And he instantly looked curious about, so where will this conversation take us? And we ended up talking about China for about, I don't know how many hours. When we stopped, people had left or were leaving. But I think it was after that we met intermittently at that period over every now and again, before I went to New Zealand in 1986. And I do remember talking to him shortly after the publication of Lanark, after I'd read it, and complimenting him on it and saying I thought it was terrific and really powerful and great and all sorts of things. And if I remember correctly, he was pressing me to criticize it, to say what I thought would be what did I think of it? What would I say critically of it? And being the young, callow, well, relatively young and certainly callow, thoughtless sort of chap that I was at that time, I said, well, I think maybe the one thing that's missing is that sense of a mature man. It's very much a male-centered Duncan Thaw, Lanark, in that sense of the young man finding out where he is, all of the trials and tribulations, and then the discovery of society and the discovery of exploitation. What can you do against it? Here you are, and then there's we come to the climax and the apocalypse and the receding of the tide. All of these things happen, It's a magnificent vision, a wonderful, wonderful epic. But I remember saying, there's that sense of I suppose I might have been thinking of Joyce and Ulysses, in that sense that when Joyce was asked a similar question, it was like, well, Ulysses is the person, because he's not only an adventurer, he's a father and a son, and that sense of a whole world of family around him. And Alasdair responded, and he thought, yeah, he said, I remember him sort of saying, it might be that I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but it was something like, it might be that I couldn't really speak of that from full experience,
Yeah.
And it was, again, it was an authentic, it felt very much like an authentic, honest answer. And I didn't want to I didn't want to sound as though I was criticizing him in that way, but it was a memorable kind of exchange of that kind. So yeah.
Can we maybe go back a little bit to what you said about this idea of almost coming to terms with it? And I guess, like anything, the sort of shock of something new and different can sort of take time to maybe fully digest in a way. But I'm interested to kind of hear your thoughts or memories of how was it received then in terms of reviews, or when did it start to feel like this is a kind of seminal work of an important work of Scottish fiction? Did it sounds like that took some time for it to be fully sort of palated in a way, but
I suppose so. I guess scholarly research would reveal the dates of the early reviews and how that came about, and I haven't done that. Partly because I don't want to. I remember reading Douglas Gifford and Cairns Craig, going down to hell is easy essay from St. Crastus, which was also going around at that time. That magazine was kind of opening the kinds of questions that were very much associated with the world of when Lanark was written and published. So critical, but it was never, I don't think it was ever really simply, this is a classic. It's like, this is a major work of curiosity. It's a new imagination at work, and it's doing something that hasn't quite been done before. I was talking about this the other day and thinking, to a student who's studying the book, and we were talking about the possible but not confirmed suicide. We're saying that in Lanark, what you get is this, if you can make a contrast with Ambrose Bierce's famous short story, The Incident at Owl Creek Bridge, which is a really shocking and really cruel story where the guy's about to be hanged, and the story is his escape until at the end, no, he has been hanged. Alasdair does not do that. And that ellipsis where you move from one story to the other, and then at another point of the book you move back, and that sense of it is, lines are firm between things, between Thaw and Lanark, but at the same time they're not firm. There's a mutability, and there's that sense of what he did. And this I think did take a bit of time to sink in. What the novel achieved, and what Alasdair did with it, is to reinstate the relationship between the imagination and reality, and that the dominance of realism had been shifted by this book in a way that hadn't really happened to the same degree in the same way before. That there was always that, there had for a long time, I think probably through the 19th century especially, although there are exceptions, major exceptions, but there was always that sense of reality is material fact and imagination is play. And what Gray did was something to redress that situation forever, I think. Yeah. And it's evident there if you put Lanark alongside, a famous trilogy of works, Edwin Morgan's Sonnets from Scotland and Liz Lochhead's play, Mary Queen of Scots Got Her Head Chopped Off. If you think of Lanark in that constellation, then you've got that same principle at work. This is not simply realism. Realism is absolutely there, but the fantasy and the imagination are at work as vitally as a realistic assessment of what reality is. So.
And I guess that critical way of reimagining Glasgow specifically, I know a lot of artists and writers sort of, talk about that sort of seminal moment and how it enabled them. I mean, what you're also talking about not just a reimagination of a place culturally and a space that it opens for that, but also the community that, you know, it's not just one individual doing that, is it? It's how you pull up and support. And from what you've said about key people that you've mentioned over the course of this discussion to other people that are around and supporting him, even you as a young, you know, writer and student, and the support, you know, this generosity that was around that kind of fostered that book in some way too.
That's absolutely true. A kind of patience as well, I take from it. Some things cannot be revealed immediately. You have to wait for them to come, and you work hard at that. And that also, I think, was a precedent, you know, for me personally, going to New Zealand, where I taught. I began teaching Lanark as a lecturer at the University of New Zealand. So we initiated the first course in Scottish literature at the University of Waikato, and Hugh McDermott, Lewis Grassy Gibbon, Liz Lochhead, John McGrath, the Cheviot, and Lanark, you know, they were all part of the work that we presented to New Zealand students. And that was also a kind of was it the longest way is the shortest way home. It's a kind of roundabout way of actually delivering the knowledge and getting back to where you want it to be. So the centrality of Glasgow in the book, I think, was felt very fondly by a lot of readers, respectfully in the best way. Like, here's something that's, I mean, I think, you know, I remember Peter Kravitz pointing out at around about the same time that some publishers would tell writers, take out the place names. Don't name Buchanan Street. And then Edwin Morgan has his poem Trio coming up Buchanan Street. And that sense of here's somewhere, here's a book in which somewhere called Unthank is actually related to the real place called Glasgow. And of course, there are places called Unthank in Scotland. And there was also that sense that not only is it centered in the city, but there's an opening out to the nation. And it's not a state of the nation novel in any conventional sense, but there is an opening out to the Highlands, to almost a dream of a pre-industrial world, or a pre-industrial world from which industrial Glasgow emerged. You know, the famous passage that everybody quotes about the nobody's imagined it, but in fact there were lots of actual novels set in Glasgow, but no one had imagined it in the way that Alasdair had, and in that sense of bringing the rest of Scotland into a configuration, and the dream and the fantasy and the imagination into terms with reality.
And do you feel that's the, like, I mean, it's hard to sum up, isn't it, in a few lines, what is the legacy or what has been the impact, cultural and beyond, of Lanark? But that reimagination, for sure, of the city, like you're talking about, this blending of the personal and the universal, kind of real and the imagined.
Yes, I think the legacy, well, you know, the famous Anthony Burgess flag. So there's a wide readership which was gained by that, and there's Alasdair's own, you know, insistence that his other books were just as important. Some of them are more important, you know, which is entirely arguable. And you can also get the sense that Alasdair himself, as the author, wants to say, don't just read that one, read these ones as well, and that's all fine. But I do think it was not only does it remain a really significant work in itself, but that historical moment of its publication was a kind of turning point. In fact, one of those moments in that decade, you know, post 79, famously, things that were paused upon, things that were beginning to, you were going to take stock of the situation in a new way, both as a critic and as an original writer, as a poet, or as a novelist or a playwright. Things had to be addressed in order to be redressed, and I think Lanark was part of that.
Yeah, well, that seems like a good place to end our conversation, Alan. Thank you so much and what an honour to have the first Grey Matters, a conversation with you. Thank you for sharing your memories.
Thanks, Sorcha. Okay, cheers.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Bye.
I've always felt that stories and pictures were a way of keeping people I knew alive and as they were.